How the Mongols outsmarted every enemy they faced. What if I told you that a group of nomadic horsemen from the middle of nowhere conquered more territory in 25 years than Rome did in 400? And what if I told you they did it not through superior numbers or better weapons, but by being so psychologically terrifying and tactically unpredictable that most enemies surrendered before the fighting even started? Welcome to Chapters in History. I'm your host, and if you love discovering how military underdogs became unstoppable superpowers, hit that subscribe button because we're diving into the most revolutionary military tactics in human history. This is how the Mongols didn't just conquer the world, because we're diving into the most revolutionary military tactics in human history. Chapter 1. The Mongol Paradox. Let's start with just how impossible the Mongol conquests should have been. In 1200 BC, the entire Mongol population was maybe 1 million people, scattered across the steppes of Mongolia. Compare that to China's 100 million, the Islamic world's 30 million, or Europe's 60 million. The Mongols had no cities, no agriculture, no written language, no advanced metallurgy. They were, by every measure of civilization that mattered in 1200, complete primitives compared to their neighbors. Yet by 1279, Mongol armies had conquered an empire stretching from Korea to Hungary, from Siberia to Vietnam. That's roughly 24 million square kilometers, about 16% of the total land area of Earth. At its peak, the Mongol Empire was 4 times larger than the Roman Empire, and twice as large as any empire in history. Here's what makes it even more incredible. They did this faster than anyone thought possible. The Mongols conquered more territory in 50 years than Rome conquered in 500. They defeated the Song dynasty, which had ruled China for 300 years. They destroyed the Khwarezmian Empire, which controlled Central Asia and Iran. They crushed the Kievan Rus, the predecessor to Russia. So how did they do it? How did a million nomads defeat civilizations that should have crushed them without breaking a sweat? The answer starts with one man, Temujin, later known as Genghis Khan, who realized something that would change warfare forever. In a world where everyone fought the same way, the person who fought completely differently would win every time. The Mongols didn't just innovate tactically, they revolutionized the entire concept of warfare. While everyone else was playing chess, the Mongols invented a completely new game, with completely new rules. Let me show you exactly how they did it, through the 5 revolutionary tactics that made the Mongols unstoppable. Chapter 2. The Mobility Revolution. Let's start with the foundation of Mongol warfare, mobility. That was so extreme it seemed supernatural to their enemies. Every Mongol warrior had not 1, but 3 to 5 horses. Not because they were wealthy, but because their entire military doctrine was built around speed. A typical medieval army moved about 10 to 15 miles per day. They had to stop for supply wagons, infantry couldn't march faster, and horses needed rest. A Mongol army could cover 60 to 100 miles per day for weeks at a time. Here's how it worked. Mongol warriors would ride one horse while leading several others. When the first horse got tired, they'd switch to a fresh one without even stopping. Meanwhile, the tired horse would rest while being led. It was like having a relay race that never ended. This wasn't just about going fast. It was about fundamentally changing what was possible in warfare. Traditional armies had to follow roads, stay near supply lines, and move predictably. Mongol armies could appear anywhere, anytime, like military ghosts. Imagine you're a Chinese general in 1211. Your scouts report a Mongol army 200 miles to the north. You have maybe a week to prepare defenses. Then, 48 hours later, that same army is attacking your city from the south. How is that possible? They couldn't have moved that fast, could they? But speed was just the beginning. Mongol armies traveled with almost no supply train. Each warrior carried everything he needed: weapons, food, tools. They lived off mare's milk, dried meat, and whatever they could hunt or raid along the way. A European army of 10,000 men needed hundreds of supply wagons, thousands of camp followers, and a logistics train stretching for miles. A Mongol army of 10,000 men needed 10,000 horses and whatever they could carry. That's it. This created what military historians call the mobility trap. Enemy armies had 2 choices: spread out to try to catch the Mongols, which made them vulnerable to concentrated attacks, or concentrate their forces, which allowed the Mongols to simply go around them and attack their cities directly. During the invasion of Khwarezmia in 1219, Mongol armies simultaneously attacked cities that were over 1,000 miles apart. The defenders literally couldn't believe it was the same army. They thought they were facing multiple invasions from different directions. The psychological effect was devastating. Enemies never knew where the Mongols would strike next. They couldn't predict Mongol movements, couldn't intercept their armies, and couldn't pin them down for decisive battles. It was like fighting smoke. In modern terms, the Mongols essentially invented blitzkrieg warfare 700 years before the Germans. They understood that in warfare, speed isn't just an advantage, it's a force multiplier that turns small armies into unstoppable ones. Chapter 3. The Feigned Retreat, Masterclass. Now let's talk about perhaps the most famous Mongol tactic, the feigned retreat. But this wasn't just run away and come back. The Mongols turned fake retreats into a psychological art form that broke enemy armies before the real fighting even started. In normal warfare, when an army retreats, it's because they're losing. Soldiers flee in panic, formations break down, and the retreating army becomes vulnerable to pursuit. Victory goes to whoever can maintain discipline longest. Mongol retreats were completely different. They were planned, organized, and executed with military precision. The retreating Mongols would maintain perfect formation, controlled spacing, and disciplined movement, while appearing to flee in terror. Here's how it worked. Mongol forces would engage an enemy army, fight for a while, then suddenly appear to break and run. Enemy commanders, seeing what looked like victory, would order pursuit. Their disciplined formations would break apart as soldiers rushed forward to catch the fleeing Mongols. The pursuing army would spread out over miles, with faster cavalry and lighter troops getting ahead of slower infantry. Command and control would break down as units got separated. What had been an organized army became a scattered mob chasing what they thought was an easy victory. Then, at the perfect moment, usually when the enemy was exhausted, spread out, and far from their supply lines, the Mongols would suddenly turn and attack. But they wouldn't just turn around. They'd be joined by fresh reserves that had been hidden nearby, turning a defeated army into a perfectly positioned ambush force. At the Battle of Mohi in 1241, Mongol forces under Batu Khan faced a Hungarian army of about 60,000 men. The Mongols engaged briefly, then retreated across a bridge. The Hungarians pursued, thinking they had won. Once the Hungarian army was strung out across the river, Mongols attacked from three sides, destroying the entire force. But the real genius was psychological. After a few encounters with Mongol feigned retreats, enemy commanders faced an impossible choice: pursue retreating Mongols and risk falling into a trap, or let them escape and face criticism for cowardice. This created what psychologists call double bind. If you pursued, you might be walking into an ambush. If you didn't pursue, you'd never win a decisive victory. Either way, you were playing by Mongol rules instead of your own. The Mongols used variations of this tactic everywhere: against the Jin dynasty in China, against the Khwarezmian Empire in Central Asia, against the Rus principalities, against Hungarian and Polish armies in Europe. It worked every single time because it exploited fundamental human psychology. Military historians estimate that Mongol feigned retreats had a success rate of over 90%. Think about that. 9 times out of 10, when Mongols pretended to run away, they ended up destroying the army that chased them. Traditional military thinking said that retreat meant defeat. Mongol thinking said that retreat was just another form of attack. By the time enemies figured this out, it was usually too late. The Mongols constantly evolved this tactic. Sometimes they'd retreat for days, drawing enemies hundreds of miles from their bases. Sometimes they'd retreat in multiple directions, then converge on a single target. Sometimes they'd retreat, then retreat again, then retreat a third time before finally springing the trap. In modern terms, Mongol feigned retreats were like a master poker player who convinces you they have a weak hand right up until they reveal a royal flush. The tactic worked because it exploited the fundamental human tendency to see what you want to see. Chapter 4: Psychological Warfare on Steroids. Now we get to perhaps the most controversial but effective Mongol tactic: psychological warfare so extreme and systematic that it became their most powerful weapon. The Mongols understood something that wouldn't be formally recognized until the 20th century. Fear is more powerful than any sword. Here's a statistic that tells the whole story. Cities that surrendered to the Mongols were typically spared and often prospered under Mongol rule. Cities that resisted were often completely destroyed, with populations massacred or enslaved. The Mongols made sure everyone knew this. The Mongols didn't just accidentally develop a fearsome reputation. They cultivated it systematically. They had sophisticated intelligence networks that spread stories of Mongol brutality far ahead of their armies. By the time Mongol forces arrived at a city, the defenders had already heard horror stories for months. These weren't random tales of violence. The Mongols crafted specific stories designed to break enemy morale. Stories of cities that fought back being erased from the map, of defenders being buried alive, of populations being systematically eliminated. True or exaggerated, these stories served a strategic purpose. When Mongol armies arrived at a city, they would typically offer terms: surrender immediately and live under Mongol protection, or fight and face total destruction. This wasn't just a military ultimatum, it was a psychological test designed to break the enemy's will to fight. At the siege of Kiev in 1240, Mongol envoys reportedly told the defenders that resistance was futile because the earth groans under the weight of our horses, and the heavens thunder with their neighing. The city's walls were strong, the garrison was large, but the psychological pressure was overwhelming. Military historians estimate that roughly 30 to 40% of cities and fortresses surrendered to the Mongols without a fight. That's thousands of potential battles that never happened, because the psychological warfare had already won the war. But here's the brilliant part. Every city that surrendered without fighting made the next city more likely to surrender. Every story of Mongol mercy toward those who submitted peacefully, combined with stories of destruction for those who resisted, created a psychological momentum that accelerated conquests. When cities did resist and were destroyed, the Mongols made sure the destruction was visible and memorable. They would sometimes leave pyramids of skulls as monuments to what happened to those who fought back. These weren't acts of random cruelty, they were calculated psychological operations. Word of these destructions would spread along trade routes, through refugee populations, and via diplomatic networks. A single city's destruction could psychologically impact enemies hundreds of miles away, making future conquests easier. Genghis Khan reportedly said, "The greatest happiness is to vanquish your enemies, to chase them before you, to rob them of their wealth." But his real genius was understanding that the threat of vanquishing enemies was often more powerful than actually doing it. The Mongols essentially invented modern psychological operations. They used propaganda, disinformation, demonstrations of force, and carefully crafted reputations as weapons that were often more effective than arrows or swords. From a purely military perspective, this made perfect sense. Why lose thousands of warriors storming a city when you could convince the city to surrender through fear? Why fight 10 battles when psychological warfare could win 9 of them before they started? In modern terms, the Mongols understood that warfare is fundamentally about breaking the enemy's will to fight, not just their ability to fight. They weaponized reputation, fear, and uncertainty in ways that wouldn't be seen again until the advent of modern information warfare. Now, it's important to note that Mongol psychological warfare often involved real violence and genuine atrocities. But from a purely tactical perspective, their understanding of fear as a force multiplier was centuries ahead of its time. Chapter 5: Intelligence and Adaptability. Here's something most people don't know about the Mongols. They had one of the most sophisticated intelligence networks in the medieval world. While their enemies saw them as primitive barbarians, the Mongols were actually information warfare specialists. The Mongol intelligence system was built on 3 pillars: merchants who traveled trade routes and gathered information, diplomats who assessed enemy capabilities, and a communication system called the Yan that could relay messages across thousands of miles faster than anyone thought possible. Mongol merchants weren't just traders, they were intelligence operatives. They would visit enemy cities, assess defenses, identify key leaders, understand local politics, and report back on everything from troop numbers to food supplies to internal conflicts. Mongol diplomatic missions served a dual purpose. On the surface, they were negotiating treaties or delivering ultimatums. In reality, they were conducting detailed reconnaissance, identifying traitors among enemy leadership, and assessing the enemy's will to fight. Before invading any territory, the Mongols would spend months or even years gathering intelligence. They'd know the locations of every major city, the strength of every garrison, the loyalty of local populations, and the capabilities of enemy commanders. Before invading the Khwarezmian Empire in 1219, Mongol intelligence operations had identified internal political conflicts, assessed the military capabilities of different regions, and even recruited local allies who were dissatisfied with the current government. But here's what made the Mongols truly dangerous: their ability to adapt and learn from every enemy they faced. When they encountered Chinese siege warfare, they recruited Chinese engineers. When they faced European heavy cavalry, they developed tactics specifically to counter it. The Mongols were military magpies. They took the best ideas from every culture they conquered: Chinese gunpowder, Islamic mathematics, European metallurgy, Persian administration. Within decades, Mongol armies were using technologies from across the known world. Early Mongol armies were weak at siege warfare because they were nomads with no experience in attacking fortified cities. But by the time they reached Europe, Mongol armies included Chinese siege engineers, Islamic counterweight trebuchets, and captured European siege specialists. Here's how Mongol adaptation worked. Encounter a new enemy tactic, analyze why it worked, recruit experts who understood it, integrate it into Mongol military doctrine, then use it against the next enemy. It was like military evolution in fast forward. When Mongols first encountered European heavy cavalry, they struggled. Knights in full armor charging with lances were different from anything they'd faced in Asia. So they adapted. They used their superior mobility to avoid direct charges, developed specialized arrows that could penetrate armor, and created tactics specifically designed to exhaust heavily armored opponents. At the Battle of Mohi, Mongols used siege engines to bombard the Hungarian camp from a distance, then used cavalry to prevent escape, combining Chinese siege technology with traditional steppe mobility tactics. Mongol command structure was also adaptive. Unlike rigid European feudal hierarchies, Mongol commanders had significant autonomy to adapt tactics to local conditions. If something worked, it was immediately incorporated into standard doctrine. The Yan communication system allowed successful tactics to be shared across the entire empire within weeks. A tactical innovation used successfully in China could be implemented by Mongol armies in Eastern Europe before the next campaign season. The Mongols created a military culture that rewarded learning and adaptation over rigid adherence to tradition. Commanders who successfully adopted enemy tactics were promoted. Those who refused to adapt were replaced. In modern business terms, the Mongols essentially invented continuous improvement and best practice sharing on a continental scale. They were constantly beta testing new military technologies and tactics, then scaling successful innovations across their entire military organization. Chapter 6: Logistics and Organization. Finally, let's talk about the Mongol advantage that nobody saw coming. Logistics and organization so efficient that it seemed supernatural to their enemies. While everyone else was struggling to feed their armies, the Mongols had solved the fundamental problem of medieval warfare. Medieval armies had a logistics nightmare. A typical European army of 10,000 men needed about 8 tons of food per day, plus fodder for thousands of horses. They needed supply wagons, camp followers, blacksmiths, cooks, and a logistics train that could stretch for miles and move at the speed of the slowest ox cart. Mongol armies had essentially no supply lines. Each warrior was self-sufficient, carrying everything needed for weeks of campaigning. They could live off mare's milk, dried meat, and whatever they could hunt or requisition along the way. Mongol military organization was based on a decimal system that was brutally efficient. Squads of 10, companies of 100, regiments of 1,000, and armies of 10,000 called tumens. This wasn't just administrative convenience, it was tactical genius. With decimal organization, Mongol commanders could rapidly reorganize forces for different missions. Need a scouting force? Take 1 man from each squad of 10. Need a rapid assault force? Take 1 company from each regiment. The mathematics made complex operations simple. This organizational flexibility meant Mongol armies could split into multiple forces, operate independently, then reconvene at predetermined locations. While enemy armies had to move as single cumbersome units, Mongol forces could operate like a distributed network. The Yam wasn't just for intelligence. It was the backbone of Mongol logistics. Relay stations every 25 to 30 miles provided fresh horses, food, and shelter for messengers. Information could travel from Mongolia to Eastern Europe in weeks, not months. This communication system allowed Mongol campaigns to be coordinated across incredible distances. In 1241, Mongol armies simultaneously invaded Poland and Hungary. Operations separated by over 500 miles, but coordinated as a single strategic plan. When Mongols needed siege equipment, they didn't carry it with them. They manufactured it on site, using captured engineers and local materials. This gave them the capabilities of a traditional army, with the mobility of a nomadic force. During the 1241 invasion of Europe, Mongol forces covered over 1,000 miles in a coordinated campaign that involved multiple armies, complex timing, and logistics coordination across half a continent. European armies could barely coordinate operations across a single kingdom. Mongol armies were also resource efficient in ways their enemies couldn't match. They could live off the land without devastating it, move without supply trains, and maintain operational tempo for months without significant logistical support. From an enemy perspective, Mongol logistics made them seem unstoppable. They appeared suddenly, fought constantly, and never seemed to run out of supplies or reinforcements. It was like fighting an enemy that didn't follow the normal rules of warfare. In modern terms, the Mongols essentially invented lean operations, just-in-time logistics, and distributed network organization 800 years before these became standard business practices. When you combine Mongol mobility, psychological warfare, intelligence gathering, adaptability, and logistics, you get something unprecedented in military history. A military system that was more efficient, more flexible, and more effective than anything that existed before or for centuries afterward. Chapter 7. The Mongol Legacy. By 1279, the Mongol Empire covered roughly 24 million square kilometers and included over 100 million people from dozens of different cultures. But the real Mongol legacy wasn't territorial, it was tactical and strategic. Mongol military innovations influenced warfare for centuries. The use of psychological operations, the importance of intelligence gathering, the value of mobility over static defense, the power of adaptive tactics, and the critical role of logistics in military success. You can trace Mongol tactical influence through military history. Ottoman cavalry tactics, Russian Cossack warfare, European light cavalry development, and even modern combined arms doctrine all show Mongol influence. Modern military strategists still study Mongol campaigns because they demonstrate timeless principles: the importance of speed and surprise, the power of psychological warfare, the value of intelligence, the necessity of adaptation, and the critical role of logistics. So why did the Mongols succeed where so many others failed? Because they understood that warfare isn't just about fighting, it's about thinking, adapting, and outsmarting your enemies before the fighting even starts. The Mongols proved that in any competitive environment, the side that innovates fastest, adapts most effectively, and thinks most strategically will usually win, regardless of starting advantages. So, there you have it, how the Mongols outsmarted every enemy they faced. It wasn't superior numbers, better weapons, or technological advantages. It was superior thinking, tactical innovation, and strategic flexibility that turned a million nomads into the rulers of the largest empire in human history. 5 revolutionary tactics, extreme mobility that redefined what was possible in warfare, feigned retreats that turned enemy psychology against them, systematic psychological warfare that won battles before they started, intelligence and adaptability that kept them ahead of every enemy, and logistics so efficient they seemed supernatural. The Mongols didn't just conquer the world, they rewrote the rules of how conquest was possible. What other military underdogs do you think deserve this kind of tactical analysis? Let me know in the comments. Hit that subscribe button for more deep dives into the strategic genius that changed history. And I'll see you in the next episode. Remember, sometimes the greatest victories come not from being stronger, but from being smarter.